Hey everyone, and welcome back to my Legion class roundup, where I level every class up to max level, gear them up, play every spec, and then share my thoughts with you. Today's episode is going to be on the Warrior. An old favourite in Warcraft and a classic fantasy archetype, the Warrior has received a really just amazing fresh coat of paint with the Legion, with the new animations, but then also a lot of mechanical changes. So, in this video, we're going to be looking at how it's fared over Legion's lifetime, how it's evolved, and where they stand today with the gameplay. Fury is currently one of the strongest DPS specs for the Warriors, and it's also the most represented Warrior DPS spec. And for damn good reason. This is a really well-rounded spec. It's got great mobility, great damage in most situations, and a rotation that is quite fun, and most importantly, fits the sort of realistic day-to-day gameplay of World of Warcraft very well indeed. This is all helped by how much Blizzard have just nailed the spec fantasy. It feels great to play. It's got excellent sound design, excellent animations, good pace of gameplay, and you also end up with this great degree of mastery over the environment due to their movement toolkit. Using Heroic Leap to climb over things, charging all about the place, it's just tremendously fun with the amount of mobility that they give you in just about all forms of content. Playing my Frost Death Knight after doing both the Demon Hunter video and now the Warrior one definitely does feel really sluggish. Like most specs, this is one that really improves when you get more gear. Looking at the stat weights, they're certainly a lot more balanced than many other classes, which is definitely a very nice touch indeed when it comes to your gearing process. Having way more haste and crit, though, does give you a faster rotation with more procs, which increases the pace of the gameplay, which gives you more mechanics to focus on, and just offers a sort of a more engaging spec. The result of this is that it starts off pretty strong, but grows really nicely as your character gears up. As always with the Legion's classes, of course, there are certain legendaries, set bonuses, and things like that, which really do impact the pace of the gameplay. Now, for Fury, it really does make it fast and fun. My live character sadly doesn't have access to the best legendaries or that 4-piece, but I have experimented with it on the PTR, and I can confirm when you've got like Convergence and a 4-piece, it's insanely fun. That said, it doesn't feel like you need those items for the spec to be fun. Now, the rotation itself is very well designed, allowing for skilled players to squeeze out extra damage while not being overly too complex for the beginners. It surrounds a mechanic called Enrage. Now, Enrage will increase your attack speed by 100% over its duration, so being enraged, of course, as much as you can is a pretty major goal. The spec's Mastery will also cause Enrage to increase the damage that you do while you're enraged, which is pretty good. Now, you can be enraged by critting with Bloodlust, which is your primary rage generator. As you can imagine, though, having bad luck with your crits isn't great, but Furious Slash exists. It's a free-to-use filler spell with no cooldown, bar the global one, that will increase the crit chance of your next Bloodthirst, and it does stack up, so that kind of counters that. All of this builds up to Rampage, which will cost most of your rage bar. Depending on your talents, it will enrage you and then whack your target a whole bunch of times. It actually does a cleave if you use Whirlwind before it, which is pretty sweet. We then have Raging Blow, which is very different depending on your talent setup. By default, it's only usable when you are enraged, but when you use a talent, you can use it when you're not enraged, which is pretty damn handy as well. Now, since that talent is basically the default choice at this stage, I'll be assuming that it's being used from now on. You then got Whirlwind, of course. It's got no cooldown, doesn't cost rage, which might seem a bit odd, but of course it has that interaction with Rampage that I covered earlier. Now, the main cooldown, Berserker Rage, is pretty sweet. It guarantees crits, and therefore it's got a really nice interaction with Bloodthirst, as it then means that, the Bloodthirst will always crit, so it will always enrage you. It's just overall a really tightly designed spec with great synergy between its various different abilities. It then has some great mechanics added on top. For example, you might notice that I'm regularly capping rage in the gameplay. That's because of Frothing Berserker, which gives you a short damage buff whenever you cap rage. So managing this, along with enraged uptime, is sort of two things that you juggle, and it's another layer of gameplay that's added on top of the excellent core rotation. It also synergizes perfectly with talented Berserker Shout, which instantly gives you 100 rage, which of course then gives you Frothing Berserker, so you can then do a Rampage, which will enrage you, and as you can see, there's a lot of synergy here. Altogether, it just forms a spec with a brilliant gameplay flow. The general pace is really fast, the abilities are all quite fun, they've all got good synergies between each other, and staying in rage, managing all those mechanics is just really engaging for me. It's also great because squeezing more out of the spec is really fun. Stuff like timing your ability usage to maximize the time your character's enraged, doing things like, say, Odin's Fury to match up with short-term beneficial effects, like, your various buffs. That's all great layers of additional thought on top of the excellent core foundations that Blizzard have built with this spec, which just come together really to make one of the best and most fun DPS specs in the game, in my opinion. Next, let's cover arms. I'm going to be straight with you, I do not like Arms Warrior at all. I generally have not in recent times, and that just is not any different with Legion. That said, I kind of understand why people would like it, and I'll admit that it does have its kind of plus points. Their burst damage can be scary, frankly, and when the procs are in your favor, it really is quite fun. Now, the core fantasy of the spec is that you don't hit as often as Fury, but when you do, you hit like a truck with a, one big, massive, two-handed weapon. And that is pretty cool, and the spec is really playing at its best whenever it's kind of meeting that spec fantasy. For me, though, the issue is that the spec doesn't have fun and engaging downtime. Once, I got better gear, I found there was less downtime, but that was replaced with a different problem. The ideal talent build for this is really intense, actually, but it's intense in a way that's really fiddly and just does not mesh with how I like to play the game. I like to keep my head in the fight and be focusing on the boss and its mechanics rather than just worrying about my class all the time. Now, it does seem like Fury outperforms Arms most of the time, and Fury just seems to be generally more fun and better designed to mesh with the way World of Warcraft is actually played, in my opinion anyway. Now that, of course, is in PvE, I can totally see how Arms and its burst windows and all that can just make it an absolute beast in PvP gameplay. Now, the core of the gameplay involves using Colossus Smash. This will put a debuff on your enemy that will increase the damage that your enemy takes from you. So, the idea is you apply the debuff, you smash their face in. Pretty simple. Now, this is mainly done with Mortal Strike, which has a 6-second cooldown, and of course just does a big bunch of damage. Then your filler is Slam. Spending Rage has a chance to reset the cooldown of Colossus Smash. So basically, whenever you're not doing Colossus Smash or Mortal Strike, you are slamming like a madman, fishing for Colossus Smash resets. Now, these three are the bread and butter of this spec, but it gets a hell of a lot deeper when your artifact weapon and a few other things come into play, especially some of your talent choices. Your artifact makes it so that your next Mortal Strike or Execute after Colossus Smash has a 30% higher crit chance and does 30% more damage. So, as you get better gear, you get more Tactician procs, you end up weaving in and out between your Colossus Smashes and your Mortal Strikes, and whenever a lot of procs are going on like that, it's really fun. You've got a lot of sort of just things to manage on a sort of regular basis, which is nice. But then it's further complicated by a talent called Focused Rage, which will increase the damage of your next Mortal Strike by a percentage, stacking up to 3 times. Now, this is pretty damn powerful when combined with the artifact trait that I mentioned earlier, but whenever you use your Rage on Focused and Rage or whatever, it means less slams if you play poorly, so there is management needed to basically use Focus Rage enough to get its damage increases, but not so much that you don't, or you miss out on using Slam, which means you'll be missing out on Tactician procs, which is just overall, it ends up being a very involved playstyle, I think, and it's just not one that really suits me. Now, I'm not against complex specs. I enjoy multi-dotting stuff. I enjoy playing specs like Feral, even though Feral hasn't been doing that great in Legion. Without that talent setup, though, without the Focused Rage, the spec just feels really empty and spammy to me. It often just comes down to using Slam a lot, which just isn't that fun in comparison to Fury. I think Arms it's kind of like Marmite. Some people really do seem to love it, so yeah, I think it's just a love it or hate it kind of deal, though I do imagine that Fury has a far broader appeal. Okay then, time for Protection, the original main tanking spec. I really do enjoy this spec quite a bit, though I've never been sure whether that's just because, the spec itself is great, or because I just enjoy tanking a lot as a break from being a DPS spec. Protection itself is quite fun in my view, though. It has a pretty robust toolkit, it's got excellent movement as well. Not only do you have Heroic Leap, but you also have Intercept, which is very similar to Charge, but it's usable on both allies and enemies, which is just dead handy. You then have some very reliable and on-demand, sort of selection of tanking abilities. All of this is once again backed up by some excellent visuals and sound design, so it's pretty solid across the board, really. Now, as always, your resource is Rage. You generate this whenever you take damage, or whenever you use Shield Slam or Thunderclap. Now, your main attack is Shield Slam. It's on a 9-second cooldown, it does strong damage, and of course will generate some rage for you. And it actually enjoys interactions with a number of other abilities in the spec. Then Devastate is your main filler spell that only really exists to fill the gap in your rotation, or at least a gap in your rotation if you don't want to spend Rage, and then to add Deep Wounds, which is a bleed onto the target, and also to fire off a proc, but more on that proc later. You then got Revenge, which is a frontal cleave that costs Rage, which is pretty important. It applies the Deep Wounds bleed and does really strong damage. And then you've got Thunderclap, which once again does nice AoE damage around your character, great for AoE threat as well, and it also slows down enemies. What's nice though is that Devastate, Thunderclap, and Revenge have a 30% chance to reset the cooldown of Shield Slam. This means overall that you're basically always doing something with this spec, be it just doing a whole bunch of Devastate so that you're not spending your Rage, or maybe you're dumping your Rage into Revenge to get more damage out. Overall, it's got a simple but sort of nice little satisfying decision making. Now, I mentioned that Devastate exists to give you a filler spell that doesn't cost Rage. That's because spamming all of your Rage into doing damage is a pretty bad idea, given how Rage fuels your entire defensive toolkit. So Ignore Pain basically consumes a chunk of Rage to give you a really big absorb shield that will soak 90% of incoming damage. Then you've got Shield Block, it's got 2 charges, gives you a 100% block for melee abilities, and it also will increase the damage of your Shield Slams by 30% when it's active, and really that's your very core. Now that is then complemented by some cooldowns like Last Stand, which increases your current and max HP by 30% for 15 seconds, and then Shield Wall, which will reduce all incoming damage by 40%. Pretty damn beefy indeed. And then for magical damage, of course, you've got Spell Reflect, which will reduce that by 30% over its duration. As you can see, it's a pretty great toolkit overall that has an answer to just about everything, and some very sort of strong, kind of like strong buttons for like oh shit moments when it all just goes south. Playing this spec has been a lot of fun for me. Playing defensively feels pretty good with its toolkit, and then playing offensively is, it's pretty fun indeed. You're spamming in a lot of abilities, you're using a lot of like Shield Slams, you're then using Shield Block as a DPS spell rather than a defensive one because of the 30% damage buff it gives. Its talent choices are also pretty good, especially having things like Shockwave for dungeons, which is really handy indeed. I don't think it's the most immediately impressive spec ever though, but it is strong, solid, and enjoyable in the long run, insofar as my own experience of it. I do think that of course it's helped by how I just enjoy tank gameplay, forming death balls, trying to lead the group at an ideal speed, dealing with boss mechanics, positioning, all of that stuff really adds to the experience of playing a tank for me, so that does come into the equation. Okay, so a quick word on class content. It's, it's pretty good for the warriors. Nothing stunning, really, but what's brilliant is the Order Hall. Now, not only does it look really cool, but it's got a great teleportation mechanic. And after using this, playing other classes who don't have it is just really frustrating now that I'm used to it. Warriors can teleport to any zone from their class Order Hall and get back to their hall from any zone. Now this is done via a teleporter in each zone's major hub, so you still do have to fly around a little bit, but the real strength of this is if you're in the Broken Shore, you can jump up to your Order Hall and then say down to High Mountain, which saves so much time, and it really is a major perk of being a warrior. So that's really the main sort of look at the class content. Now let's talk about pains and gains, which is really the section where I sort of cover the pros and cons generally of the class. Having a tank spec is just a luxury after maining a pure DPS for ages. You can get into Mythic Plus groups far faster, all of your random queues are instant, it's just great for, getting shit done, which is pretty nice. I also mentioned the teleporter, which once again is brilliant. I think these two things are pretty large boons to the general experience of playing the class. It's just really convenient. Fury then has talent builds, which are great in the open world, and also other talent builds, which are really fun in raids. So it basically just feels really powerful everywhere. The only downside is that their self-heals either come from a talented charge or from enraged regeneration. I'd maybe rather that they got like a sizable lifesteal whenever they hit low health, or maybe if killing mobs would reduce the cooldown of enraged regeneration, something like that. Fury does perform great as well, and as I said, it's just one of those specs that fits boss fights really well. Now, a slight downside is that you do need to wait until you get a little bit of gear to start enjoying it fully, but really that doesn't take too long in patch 7.2. Generally speaking, I don't have any major issues or annoyances, bar arms, almost in its entirety, which would be a worry for me if it was to become the front runner in terms of performance by a wide margin, so that definitely is a negative point on the Warrior for me. But to conclude, I think Warriors are in a fantastic state gameplay-wise. They've got a really solid and dependable tank spec that's quite fun to play, though maybe a little bit less exciting than something like the Vengeance Demon Hunter. They've got one of the most fun-to-play DPS specs in the game with an amazing rotation once you get more gear and some trinkets. And I guess some people enjoy arms. Overall, though, the Warrior does get my seal of approval, and it's something that I think I can heartily recommend to anyone. So that's it for the Warrior class review. Overall, definitely looking very good for the Warriors. And that's really it for the video. You can check out the previous videos in this series with the YouTube card, which will appear somewhere on the screen. So previously I've done the Demon Hunter and the regular Hunter, so you can check both of those out. But that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.